Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in today. I know a lot of us in the audience are in Canada, and we'll get to this later, but I think it's a particularly important moment to be having a conversation around Canada, Canadian manufacturing, and Canada's role in the global economy and the global stage, and what the next 5, 10, 15 years could look like for Canadian companies and Canadian manufacturers, and then, by proxy, all of us as Canadian citizens and residents. So, really excited to have this conversation around sustainability and climate reporting, and how leveraging those concepts and those practices can really help Canadian businesses kind of be leaders on the global stage. Today, just to introduce myself, my name is Lauren. I'm with Carbonhound, and our sort of guest of honor today is Jayson Myers at NGen. I'll let him introduce himself in a second as well. But if you haven't yet been introduced to Carbonhound, at Carbonhound, we're based here in Toronto, and we help businesses of all sizes understand their climate impact, measure that impact, and then use that reporting for whatever it is they need, of which Sanders and Jay will get into in the conversation. So just a quick run of show. After my little introduction here, I'll pass it off to Jay and Sanders to have a conversation. And then at the end, we'll have some time for questions. So all throughout the conversation, if you have any questions, please feel free to leave them in the chat there. And then at the end, I'll come back on. I'll sort of pick those out and then pose them to Jayson and Sanders. So without further ado, pass it off to Jay to introduce himself and speak a bit around NGen and his perspective of sort of the landscape right now for Canadian manufacturers.
Great. Well, thanks very much, Lauren, and both to you and Sanders. Thanks very much for inviting me here. We have, I think, a very exciting future ahead for both Carbonhound and NGen in a new partnership. And let me just talk a little bit about why that's so important. For those who don't know what Next Generation Manufacturing Canada, or NGen, does, we're an industry-led, not-for-profit organization. We're really focused on building the best in advanced manufacturing capabilities in Canada for the benefit of Canadians. And we do that by raising money from different sources to invest in projects that really lead to collaborative projects that really lead to transformative new solutions to support productivity or competitiveness of Canada's manufacturing sector. I think the key here is the collaborative nature of what we do, because it really takes an integration of technologies and, of course, working with manufacturers to make a difference here. But collaboration is key, and we're also focusing on how do we support Canada's advanced manufacturing sector as a whole, including providing intelligence about climate change regulations, about funding opportunities, and primarily the continuing importance of thinking about sustainability here and mitigating climate risks. I think this is really important. When we're looking ahead, of course, the key word right now to describe the situation in Canada's manufacturing sector is tremendous uncertainty. 2 words, but uncertainty. I think when Prime Minister Carney made his remarks at Davos, he really underlined that the existing systems of the world order has changed, and we have to be very realistic about it. We have to come up with new collaborative initiatives, particularly among middle powers here, and that's true in the geopolitical sense, but it's also true in the industrial sense in what's going on in manufacturing. It can't be business as usual. The market environment has changed. It's not going to go back to where it was before. And so companies really need to make some crucial decisions, strategic decisions about where they're going as a business, going into new markets, for instance, finding new customers. That's what it's all about. And it's not necessarily going internationally. It's finding customers here in Canada as well, strengthening their supply chains, making sure that they have a much more resilient access to the technologies they require, to the skills they require, but also the materials and the components that go into manufacturing. And of course, focusing on how do you not only invest in new technologies, but how do you get the best out of the technologies you're investing in here? So that requires primarily a rethink of strategic in terms of strategic leadership, but it also requires a much more of a focus on good management practices in manufacturing, how to drive new value for new customers, and how to ensure that all those non-value adding activities are being reduced as rapidly as possible. The two main principles of good manufacturing management here. So what does this mean for where does sustainability, where does the mitigation of climate impacts come into this? I think the key issue here is to realize that just because President Trump isn't paying as much attention to this, and even though climate action is not making the headlines that it may have been last year at this time, at least in Canada and in North America, nevertheless, these issues are becoming, I would argue, even more important. And Sanders can fill in some of the details here. But first of all, let's realize that the regulation around climate action has not gone away. We may not see as much regulation at the federal level in the United States, but we sure are seeing more standards, more regulations being put in place at the state level in the US. In Europe, they're on track to meet their target of reducing emissions by 55% by 2030 and become climate neutral by 2050 here. So they have a pretty ambitious regulatory program, including carbon border adjustments where new fees will be coming into place as of 2026 for high carbon intensive imports into Europe. So for Canadian companies here, first of all, understanding the regulations, realizing that those regulations are only going to get tighter over the years ahead. There's no sign of regulatory lightening. And in fact, even in China, the new Chinese climate operating standards show that this is, regulatory push here for action, mitigating action around climate impacts is going to be even more prevalent across Asia and across other countries as well, not only in Europe. As I mentioned, market access is important. As companies are thinking about accessing the European market, or even the Chinese or the Japanese markets and the Asian markets, where climate adjustments or carbon adjustments are also likely going to be coming into effect, it's important to be able to meet the requirements of here just to get into the marketplace, and so measuring emissions, being able to report emission content in the products, and the products that are being exported into Europe, and especially for high carbon intensive products, is going to be key if any company is looking at exporting into new markets, and primarily right now into Europe. But I've got to say as well, this is really important for new procurement opportunities in Canada. It's not just going into international markets. Here, the federal government, provincial governments are putting in place, of course, major procurement programs in infrastructure, for instance, in critical projects, but also in defense, in home building. But we're already seeing conditions applied to those procurement programs here. Conditions around not only measuring emissions, but also taking action to reduce emissions. So in many cases, it's not only access to international markets, it's also access to some pretty important domestic markets as well, that the manufacturers are going to have to take into or manufacturers need to take into consideration. How do they report their emissions, and what are they doing to reduce those emissions? I think on top of that, it's not just government regulations. It's the requirements of several large companies that we have multinational organizations, multinational enterprises that have made commitments to reduce emissions and made commitments across their supply chain as well, the Scope 3 emissions too. So as we move forward, these commitments haven't changed. In fact, they've kind of consolidated. Even the voluntary emissions, and Sanders can speak to this, even companies that have made voluntary emission commitments here are now finding that they need to follow up on those, because that's created liability for those companies. So major multinationals, where there may be some opportunity for Canadian companies to expand their market opportunity, they're finding new customers in other multinationals, are going to find it really important as well to be able to not only report emissions, but to show how they're mitigating and reducing their emissions too. And it can be a major advantage for Canadian companies if they can show that our lower emission energy sources are a key part of why a multinational company might want to procure from Canadian manufacturers. On top of that, of course, is the financial sector here. Banks that are looking at emission performance of their clients, in many cases providing new finance or providing lower cost of capital for companies that are making progress on emission reductions. But I want to flag in particular the insurance industry. We've had a report out this week from the Insurance Bureau of Canada flagging that $2.4 billion in insured losses as a result of climate events in Canada in 2025. So that's just an example of what I think the insurance companies are extremely concerned about: mounting costs of insurance. The large multinational reinsurers are requiring their clients to ensure that their clients report emissions and on track to also reduce emissions here. So it very shortly, it could be a situation manufacturers simply won't be able to get operating insurance, commercial insurance, unless they can report emissions and show that they're on track to mitigate. So all sorts of reasons why I think Canadian manufacturers need to position sustainability, and particularly emission measurement and emission reductions, as a very important part of how they are responding to all of this market uncertainty. If you're going into new markets, if you're going to be focusing on improvements in technology and in management, then sustainability, emission reporting, and emission reduction has to be a key part of that. Let me turn it over to Sanders, though, because I've been talking in pretty general terms, and maybe you can fill in some of those details.
There's so much to cover there. I think, building off of the initial comments from Carney, I think is really important, right? So 12 trade deals in the last 6 months, right? I think was the number that he used. And there's a lot more coming, right? And so I think fundamentally, when we look at a market like the US, very business friendly, regulatory fairly light compared to a lot of these other regions that we're looking at. And uncertain is definitely the right word to use. I don't know, after yesterday, I'm feeling a little bit more optimistic. I'm feeling like there's a lot of opportunity too. And I think you brought up a lot of the opportunities. And I think when he talks about making, every country building a fortress, manufacturing is a pretty core component of building a fortress as a country, to be able to feed ourselves in food manufacturing, or, build what we need for defense. I think there's a huge opportunity there for us to grow our internal market. And the one word that, if you look at Carney's track record, one word he used last night was sustainable, right? Like that's part of the equation here. So I think that what Jay was talking about in a lot of circumstances is really impactful. And I think, when looking at how climate and sustainability data can impact your business, I like to think about it in two different lenses, right? Actually, three. So one is the regulatory lens. So what do I need to access new markets? And I'll talk about that in a second. The second one is the operational lens, which is how can I improve the efficiency of my business? Because ultimately, sustainability data is actually a combination of operational data, accounting data, and financial data. And it's incredibly rich as a data set to be able to look at and be able to identify opportunities within your operations. And the less natural gas you use, the less money you're spending, and the more efficient your business becomes, right? So carbon and dollars are very much intertwined. And then the third category, I would say, is the financial and kind of the financial well-being of your business as well, and thinking about how we can take advantage of this shift towards sustainable procurement to improve the financial well-being of your business. So I'm actually going to start on that one very briefly because you mentioned the insurance business. I think some numbers also came out, I think it was Monday, really fascinating, saying that in the EU, they're already starting to see costs of capital for businesses increase and be about 12 to 23% higher than for businesses that are more exposed to climate risk than to those companies that aren't, right? France has some funding that you can get up to a 50% discount on your interest rates if you're meeting certain criterion as it relates to the sustainability of your business. Even in Canada, you look at the farm credit, the FCC, they just ran a pilot where they're giving, I think it was 50 basis point reductions on funding for farmers, et cetera, that are using more sustainable practices. So we're talking to RBC and BMO and to those sorts of businesses about how can we create new products to help incentivize the sustainability of your operations, because increasingly it's becoming a risk question for those audiences, right? So, and not only that, look at the work that Jay is doing on this, sustainable, the grants available for energy efficiency, for you name it, for sustainability, for improving the sustainability of your operations. There's money out there where if you think about your capital project plan with the lens of sustainability, because let's be honest, most capital projects, or many of them, are going to be about improving capacity and efficiency of your business. And the more efficient your business is, actually the less carbon intensive it is. So there might also be opportunities to think about how to access new streams of financing opportunities as well as grant opportunities that businesses don't even think about. So, looking at the ITC, so there's new tax credits for certain types of investments in your business where you can get up to 60% of your capital back, right? So, there's billions of dollars worth of opportunity on that side to help improve the capital efficiency of your business. And I think that that's something that, really dovetails nicely into, competing effectively in these markets where sustainability really matters. So whether it's government contracts, whether it's exporting and opening up new markets in Europe, there's huge opportunities across the entire spectrum there. And Jay, if you want, what I can do is I can maybe just go through even some updates over the last 6 months in the regulatory environment, and get a bit more specific on that, just to put a finer point on it, if that's helpful.
Yeah, that would be great. That'd be great.
Okay, so I was doing some research earlier this week, and so I think just to give an understanding of, now we're going to focus more on the regulatory side of that equation. So we've talked a little bit about the finance, we've talked a little bit about the operational. Now we're going to focus on the regulatory side, which obviously unlocks revenue opportunities. So if you're looking at the largest businesses in the world, between 35 to 70,000 of the largest businesses in the world by 2030 are either already reporting on it today or will be reporting by 2030, right? So you can imagine the number of supply chains that impacts. So looking at the US, I think they're the most interesting one because there's the most noise there. You've got California, which is still proceeding with SB 253, which requires all businesses over $1 billion in revenue to basically go into their supply chains and get a better understanding of what the impact of them are. There's also New York State just implemented a new piece of legislation there Colorado, New Jersey, Illinois all have them sitting in some form of draft that they're kind of working on to proceed to the next step. So that's just the U.S. There's a lot more coming there too, I think. And I think that Trump is really going to continue to create two different worlds, right? You're going to see the coastal states and the more blue states take one approach, and the middle states not so much worry about this. But for those who are looking to export to other markets, I think it increasingly becomes important. We've got companies. We've got a catfish company in Middle America that uses us because their suppliers are requiring them, or their customers are asking for this information. They don't see it going anywhere, right? I can't think of anything more emblematic than fishing in the Catskills, right? So really thinking about even the places you wouldn't expect, they're still seeing demand and pressure for these kinds of requests. Looking at Europe specifically, CSRD, they've removed 90% of the businesses from the scope of that. So that would have required almost 10 times more businesses to disclose their emissions, but it's still covering all the larger businesses that you probably would be dealing with anyways, right? So all the 1,000+ employee businesses with over 450 million in turnover still have to comply. The UK is even a bit stricter. It's companies over 250 employees. Australia, they recently put in regulations scope 1 to 3 for all listed companies and those who are in the finance industry and government. Japan, same thing. They're phasing in mandatory requirements for listed companies. China, again, same thing. This is all happening over the last 6 months. Shift from planning to implementation, now mandatory for key industries and will be for listed companies over the next few years. That's just the purely businesses being regulated. Then, let's talk about selling into these new markets, right? So we've got the carbon border adjustment mechanism that Jay was talking about. That continues to impact companies who are importing into Canada. We've got companies who work with Stellantis, with GM, with, you name it. Anyone who's exporting into those markets from the U.S. and Canada, they're being forced to disclose their emissions because they're now being taxed on that as of 2026. So as an example, the carbon prices for the EU now per ton that you're importing of the material, per emission ton, so metric ton of emissions, CO2e, it's now up to 140 CAD per ton that you're paying to import that product into the EU. That's up from almost 40% from May of last year. So, and we're just at the beginning of this market where, no one's actually had to purchase them yet. So there's a huge market mechanism here that could really impact the competitiveness of products being sold into the EU that you really need to think about, especially if you're selling aluminum and steel products. It's something that you should really be thoughtful about. The other thing is that carbon border adjustment mechanism is going to be expanding the definition of what's going to be covered, right? So it's no longer just going to be the amount of raw aluminum or steel that you're importing, that's embedded in those products. Is going to be the whole thing, right? So they're adding 180 different products to CBAM over the next 12 months as well, including machinery and equipment, vehicles and components. They're not just going to be looking at the metal components, but like the entire vehicle embodied emissions, finished metal products like screws, bolts, nuts, etc., household appliances, like all of that stuff is going to be covered by CBAM over the next period of time as well. So, they're seeing the success in creating these, kind of rules-based tariffs really around the environmental impact of products that they're bringing in to protect their own industry. And I think that's why when we look at the posture that Canada is taking right now, would it surprise anybody if we started aligning more to European standards on, EVs, even look at the car standards, looking at standards as it relates to sustainability? Why shouldn't we be protecting our own businesses and ensure that they can compete on the same fair footing as their counterparts who have no environmental regulations in their area of the world, right? So I think we do need to strengthen the government's going to be looking at how they can strengthen our competitiveness, and I do feel like that's going to come in terms of harmonizing us more with European and other markets that are similar, and creating opportunities for Canadian businesses to be more have a lower or have a higher ability to compete within the Canadian market as well as abroad, as we continue to build that local manufacturing capacity. So there's a lot there. I think I talked for almost as long as you did, Jay.
Yeah.
But
Sorry, go ahead.
No.
No, I was going to say, Sanders, as you're talking about the carbon border adjustment mechanism, it really is a different type of tariff here in Europe, and probably we'll see it more in more countries as well, focusing on probably real security concerns rather than made up ones, as the Trump administration is focusing on. But sustainability is really being seen much more as a global security issue here. But what it really reminds me of in the situation with Canadian companies right now is exactly the problem that we found earlier this year when the U.S. imposed tariffs, but not for manufacturers that were already compliant with rules of origin under the Canada, U.S., Mexico trade agreement here. But what we found was that something like 65%, 2/3 of the products entering the U.S. Actually being imported by the U.S. Were not actually compliant with the trade agreement because companies hadn't bothered to. It was cheaper for companies to pay, a relatively low 2% tariff than to actually go through the requirements to become CUSMA compliant. And I think we're kind of in the same situation right now. If companies are actually looking at doing business, and not only in Europe, but probably in other markets around the world, and in the very near future here in Canada too, then they need to become emission compliant here, and they need to focus on I think three things. And I learned this from you, Sanders, is not only measuring emissions, and there are other good reasons I'll get to in a minute why you want to do that, but to actually know what you are emitting here. Secondly, a validation of those measurements here, because it's not just good enough for a company to report. It really needs to be validated in some way to be acceptable through many of the regulatory bodies. And then the third thing, of course, is actually taking action to reduce those emissions, which is also part of the expectation here, regulatory expectations, as well as those of many of the major customers that manufacturers are looking to serve or are serving right now. So all of this is really important, but I want to go back to, there are a couple of other points that you were raising. One is just that measurement is the beginning of being able to make any sort of improvements at all. You can't, and it was Peter Drucker that said many, many years ago, you can't improve, measure here. And of all things to measure, energy consumption and emissions are probably the key to understanding industrial processes for any company, any manufacturer here. On the energy side, all we're going to see is energy costs increasing, and particularly the cost of electricity, which is going up here in Canada as a result of population growth, economic growth, and where new technology is going. AI and data centers, we're seeing massive electrification and massive demand increases here. Even, we have a pretty clean electricity grid, but that doesn't mean it's going to be cheap. going forward. And when we look at other, natural gas, and which is going to be used more and more for electricity generation, when you look at the future of nuclear, which is going to take some time to come into play in Canada, all I can see is increasing energy costs. So to be able to effectively measure energy consumption and to look at how to drive those costs down through better energy management, as you say, Sanders, has a direct impact on emissions. But it only makes sense for companies to be able to do that and to translate measurement around energy use, which is tied to cost, into emission reductions. The other thing, though, that is, I think, really important to understand, and it goes into some of the other financing opportunities as well, is that can't just focus on emission reduction alone. It has to be part of an overall business strategy to improve productivity and competitiveness. I talked about energy management, but it really goes to the heart of how do companies position themselves so they're getting a better return on their capital investment. Clearly, the use of new technologies and maybe AI, industrial AI in particular, where AI is being integrated into physical equipment, physical processes, is going to be key for making productivity improvements. And so looking at how other technologies can help to help both on the measurement side as well as opportunities to reduce emissions over time, I think is going to be key. And this is where I think Carbonhound comes into play, because you're using the latest technology here, the latest AI, the latest information and data analytics to help companies really understand their processes. It comes to whether it's energy or emissions or just a better understanding of process here is going to be fundamental. That's where productivity improvements begin. And it has to be incorporated into really good management practices here. I see so much waste on the part of companies that waste in terms of activities that don't lead anywhere, investments in technology that stand idle and not used because there are sunk costs in wrong technology decisions here. So, this is, I think, the whole area of measurement and being able to effectively manage the use of technology is so important in manufacturing today that there isn't a lot of cash, so there isn't a lot of room for mistake anymore. And so companies really need to focus on those areas of waste that they can control, drive efficiencies up and costs down. And I think, as I was saying, that really begins with good measurement that can be translated into measurement about emissions and then translated into areas of productivity improvement, continue to drive down.
And I think it also becomes a really important conversation where, yes, we have to meet these regulations. That's kind of the table stakes, right? So get the data because you want to export to these markets, but then how do you mine that sustainability data for all these other insights that can help improve the effectiveness of your business? Which means that, great. So you do the reporting to export into the EU, right? Let's say, but you're still being effectively tariffed on the materials that you're importing in. So now the next question is, okay, how do we reduce the amount of steel or aluminum or products that are, problematic in those products? And that becomes the next phase. Thinking about, for example, we've got a company of ours that builds plastic molds for businesses, and you would think that wouldn't be exactly a place where someone like us would be helpful. But what they're doing is they're actually looking at, they've got their own proprietary technology that allows them to create molds that allow companies to use less plastic to get the same strength in their products. And that drops their resin costs by 30%, which is a huge bottom line impact. But resin's also their number one GHG contributor as well, right? So And then not only that, it becomes lighter for them to transport, to and from the factories. There's all sorts of these other benefits that are that come alongside that. So it's kind of taking that mentality of just looking at the problem from a different perspective and thinking about quality as it relates to not just the price and maybe the performance, but also the sustainability performance of that product that allows you to think about things differently. And I think the other thing that's really fascinating is that fundamentally what we've noticed is that when you start getting into the details of deep decarbonization, it really, the best ideas always come from the people that are on your team, right? There's always some, and people are motivated by different things, right? And so one person might want to bring up an opportunity to reduce the amount of waste, because they're interested in reducing waste, or they maybe want to get a promotion, so it's more about that. But everyone's got their own reasons for doing this, and so in creating a multitude of different motivational factors, i.e., hey, yeah, this doesn't just reduce waste; it reduces our carbon emissions, which helps, with this, philosophical fight against, not really philosophical, this actual fight against climate change. Some people are going to be more motivated to look for solutions when they've got that framing versus somebody who's just looking to help cut costs for a business that maybe they don't care as much about, right? So how do we create and enable this new workforce that cares a lot more about climate to find opportunities and efficiencies that we wouldn't have found before? And then that opens up new opportunities for efficiency and productivity gains that we might not have seen otherwise.
Yeah, I agree, and it just talks to the new environment we're in here, where on one hand, companies need to look at their own supply chain, and sure, look at it from the point of view of emissions through the supply chain, but also look at it from the point of view of how can you, as you say, reconstruct the supply chain so that you have perhaps a more resilient supply here. That the supply chain restructuring today is pretty much of a priority right across Canada's manufacturing sector for various reasons. But here's an opportunity to look at as looking at new supply, exactly as you say, looking at those suppliers that are more productive and can offer different types of solutions to the sustainability problem, as well as to your productivity issues as well. I think the other part here is to look, you have to position this as part of, it's not just, climate impact mitigation, and it's not just energy management, it's an overall productivity issue here and good management issue. But in terms of accessing funding too, sure, and you signaled, Sanders, some of the great tax breaks that that were announced in the federal budget for sustainable technology or investments in clean tech here, which is really, really, really important. But there are all sorts of other programs there for instance, and some of them that we provide, funding for adoption of industrial AI. So AI that can be integrated into your operating systems, into your production systems, so you can better identify those areas for improvement, for example, or you can actually use AI solutions to do predictive or predictive maintenance here to improve the efficiency of your operating capital, to reduce defects. All of these technology applications are there that will also, they'll improve productivity, performance, and competitiveness, but they'll also, as you said, Sanders, lead to pretty significant emission reductions as well. So it's important to take a look more generally, and there are lots of funds that may not be focused particularly on emission reduction or energy management, but on adoption of other technologies that can help to drive performance improvement.
100%. And, I'm talking to these bankers at these sustainable finance divisions at the large big five banks, and they're saying, hey, we want to be putting more money into this, right? So it's also the availability of capital to deploy into these projects as well that's expanded. So it's not just the coupon that you can get for sure, but also the amount of financing that you can get access to is also being impacted. And fundamentally, I love it. It just becomes this virtual cycle, right? Because you've got 35,000 to 70,000 largest businesses in the world who care about this. And so even as you make these improvements and become a more efficient business and more energy efficient business, you can then effectively resell that as a benefit to your customers, right? And then that obviously helps improve your access to different markets, helps improve your, in some cases, margins, right, as well, that you can charge for those more environmentally friendly products, and or outcompete others who are in a more commoditized space, right? So, if you're that, I think that's a really interesting. It becomes a differentiator in these commodity markets. And so there's an example of, I'm not sure if you saw, it was actually on the list of projects for Kearney, the Nouveau Monde graphite site outside of Montreal. So I know that story a little bit because they were pretty much the only 90% of the world's graphite comes out of China, right? And so back to your diversification of supply chains comment, right? This is a great example where it was going to be more expensive for them to pull it out of the ground here than it would have been in China. But what they did is they created the world's first electrified graphite mine. And they partnered with Caterpillar and all these big businesses, just this small little company of like 10 people. All these big businesses wanted to work with them because they wanted to use it as a proof of concept. And then once they were able to prove that out, they got, I think, Panasonic and a bunch of these other large OEMs who started buying their graphite from them for higher prices than what they would have paid if they had gone to China. And so they've created a whole market, sustainable product in Canada, mined in Canada, diversified supply chain. And and now they're doubling down on that with the government supporting them on this next phase. So I think it's one small example, but an inspiring one of what we can do when we think about things a little bit differently.
Exactly. I see Lauren is back to keep us on track here.
I am, and I'm excited to kind of jump in at this point with a few questions, from the perspective of some of these companies who are hearing this and thinking, okay, well, what do I do with all this information, right? And so I love, Sanders, that we ended there on this example of the tangible, return on that investment to be sustainable. But I'm conscious that that required a ton of capital and a ton of risk to create this electrified mine and to kind of build the framework and the technology and all these things to potentially have a positive outcome. And a lot of the people that I talk to are still seeing sustainability as a cost center. And they're thinking, okay, great. I see all these grants, I see this funding available, but it's still just 50% matching. Or I'm still going to have to sort of put up that initial, investment to overhaul my line or to electrify my fleet. So I wonder from Jay, with some of the funding that NGen is putting out and facilitating, if you can kind of speak to the way that you're helping companies understand that risk, benefit, and outcomes. And then for Sanders, if you know of any other examples or just from your perspective, what you might say to a company who still sees this as a cost center and doesn't know how to take action on that risk.
I think a couple of things. There is risk in these investments here. It costs money, but as Sandra said, we're also seeing other funding opportunities here or investment opportunities that are lining up to be able to offset some of those costs. At NGen, we provide 35-40% funding for big sustainability, innovative processes that lead to better sustainability in manufacturing. We have a really great project with Ashgrove Cement to capture carbon and inject it into into modern concrete production, which is another example here of some of it's a new process. It's being piloted here, and there's a tremendous amount of capital, but it's also very much like your story, Sanders, attracted a great deal of interest from major investors, including the biggest cement company in the world here. So, I think, frankly, here's the choice. There are costs involved. The investments are risky. Companies need to be very careful the way they manage these projects, and that's why I go back to business leadership and good project management here, because it's one thing to invest in technologies, totally different thing to actually be able to use them productively. So, I think there's a great deal that needs to be done to improve management of how these technologies are actually not only implemented but continue in use. But at the end of the day, the decision is to take those risks or go out of business, because companies are not going to be able to go into new markets, find new customers, or even acquire innovation partners or better terms on funding and capital, unless they actually take this risk. So yeah, sure, it costs money. The outcome is uncertain, but there's a lot of stuff that companies can do to improve the management of these projects and to make smart investments. But as I said, I mean, it comes down primarily to measuring how do you know what the risk is or what the return on investment is, unless you actually measure what you're trying to improve. And so it comes down to this issue. Do you really know even if you know where you're going as a business or what you want to do as a business, do you really understand what the critical processes are and where there are opportunities for improvement? And that really depends on your ability to measure and then to follow up on that to improve.
Yeah, it's funny you say that, because we're starting to build more into the platform around how we can start to automate the reporting of the impact of those projects, so you can get a better understanding of, without having to do the math every month, actually just knowing on an ongoing basis how much have you saved in energy costs, how much have you saved in terms of maybe material goods that you've had to, if you're reducing your resin usage by 30%, that's obviously pretty big savings potentially, right? So really, I think, to your point, Jay, this is a point of, you shouldn't do this unless there's a business case to do it. No one is saying that you should do this because you believe in fighting climate change. I mean, great. If that's what your motivation is, fantastic. And I'm here for that. But realistically, you have to make a business decision, and it has to come with a business case. And I think what we're seeing is that increasingly, especially when you look at 35, 40+% effectively, discounts on those projects due to the funding availability, that there's a lot more of them, quote unquote, in the money than you might think. This is not a charity situation. This is a way to improve the efficiency of your business and the competitiveness of your business. And if you don't look at these opportunities, then other people will. The brand new factories of today do not look the same way that they did 100 years ago, right? So this is really just part of that progression in terms of, the more environmentally friendly we are, the less inputs we have, the less risk there is in my supply chain as well, right? So there's actually, it's not just about being environmentally friendly, it's about thinking about the operating model for the entire business. You're not going to have risks around license to operate as much as well, right? So there's all sorts of different monetary and non-monetary impacts, I think, when considered. In addition, and then you add the grants and the availability of capital for these projects. I think that's where I get really excited, because we're at the point now where, just as a brief example, I think it was 98% of new capacity and electricity that was added is solar and battery, right? And because it's the cheapest form of electricity to add to the market, it's not because China thinks that this is the best way, that they're not making some ideological argument here. They're doing it because it's the cheapest way for them to get energy to their people and support their economy. So we're at the phase now where these technologies are at a point where it really does make sense to look at it and to invest in your business with this in mind. And I think that's why this is the right moment for NGen and Carbonhound to be working together, because we're starting to see the confluence of all these different technology developments that have been happening over the last 50 years come to a point where it actually really does make sense to rethink how we're doing business, especially with the broader economic and political environment adding additional layers of risk on top of that.
And, to channel Prime Minister Carney, this isn't a theoretical argument. It has to come, as you say, it has to be based on good business reasons here. But there are also so many good use cases, and this is where Carbonhound can really help. There's so many good use cases out there about how companies can take action around emission reductions, but primarily, how this is integrated into their business strategy, into their other technologies, delivering productivity improvements. And there are other use cases as well around industrial AI applications or robotics 100%. Applications or automation applications. And this is something that NGen can help to facilitate as well. So companies are not necessarily just sort of operating in the blue here. There are good examples of what they can do. But I think the important thing here is the question about, okay, well, what are the business requirements for successful application of these or adoption of these use cases, for example, or the technologies in these use cases? And that's where I go back to the real importance of good project management here of, if we're looking at driving productivity improvements and competitiveness here and leading to emission reduction, then it really is a system-wide issue for any business. You need finance involved. You need strategitic leadership. You need the finance group involved. You need the technical group and the IT group and the manufacturing group involved. And so it really goes back to, as we said right at the very beginning, it can't be business as usual. You really need to take a very close look at where the business is going, what are the critical processes, and how can you where are improvements in those processes, and then think about what you need in terms of technology to deliver that. But measurement's crucial, and I think as you said, Sanders, companies that are making productivity improvements and efficiency improvements are naturally reducing emissions.
Great, thanks both. We are a little short on time. We have 2 quick questions from the audience, so I'll ask for 5-second answers to each of these before we wrap it up. If possible. The first question is probably more for Sanders, but the question is coming from Paul, and he says, do you anticipate that these sort of tracking and production methods are going to require custom solutions for each business? So, is this going to be a problem that is easily solved by any old person, or sort of does each business require these custom solutions to report the way that they need to and to track the way that they need to?
I think there's 2 different pieces to this. One is the tracking, and the second one is the ideation and implementation of the right technologies to make the improvements that you want. I think when we think about the tracking on our side, that's really what we focus on a lot, just because if we get the data right, then that makes a lot of other things easier. But on the tracking side, we think about how we can be very configurable. And so part of our process is that you'll have somebody that you work with and will configure the platform to meet the exact needs of your business and the context of your business and your suppliers and your, everything as it relates to the operational boundaries that you're working within. When it comes to the solutions of how you improve the productivity, that is so dependent on what machines you have in place, the actual configuration of the machines, the physical, maybe the location of your warehouses. Like, there's so many specific components that can drive massive massive differences in terms of which projects might be the right ones for you. So what we do is we've got a list of kind of low-hanging fruit projects that you can use that we know will generally be applicable. But then we also have partners, and I'm sure Jay does too, where there's folks that really specialize, like engineering firms that will come in and do that work to try to figure out a roadmap for you to get to that next level. And I don't believe that software is going to ever solve 100% of the problem. I think it's always going to be a combination of software and expertise that's going to get you to that destination that you're looking for. So we don't try to do everything. What we try to do is make sure that we're giving you the right person at the right time with the right scope so that you're maximizing every dollar that you're spending when you're looking at these initiatives.
Perfect. Thanks. The last question here is from Peter, and I don't know if either of you are familiar with the First Movers Coalition for Food, but just a cursory look. It's kind of something that came out of the World Economic Forum back in 2023, where a number of leading food companies, multinational food companies, created this commitment around procurement of 10-20 billion dollars in sustainable procurement by 2030. The question is kind of what's the role and effectiveness of programs like this? And I know we sort of touched on it earlier, just around this is happening as a steady drumbeat in the background. This started in 2023 and the goals are for 2030. And so even though today's conversation might have pulled back from sustainability commitments, programs like this have been in place and have goals for the future, and so are kind of continuing. So I guess it's just a question about either this specific coalition, but more generally around these commitments that national governments have made or independent companies have made around sustainable procurement, and what is the effectiveness? What are we seeing the impact in supply chain and in companies who supply these multinationals?
Well, it's a good example of I think some of these large multinational companies that have voluntary, but also they're meeting requirements for their own business here, and requirements to drive emission reductions throughout their supply chain. But we're seeing similar things on the food side, but also similar things in textiles and consumer products here, and we're also seeing an alignment of regulations and standards here, aligned with the voluntary efforts of many of these companies that tend to be, as you were saying, Sanders, start off as voluntary, and they tend to be more solidified as the companies think about the liabilities that they're facing, even under a voluntary standard. So very much though, like on the automotive side, the aerospace side, you've got major multinationals that are, for various reasons, looking at the carbon footprint of their supply chain and trying to, and not only their suppliers, but the entire supply chain, the transportation networks, the logistics behind this, is the warehousing behind this, the whole distribution system. And a lot of this is being driven by major retailers and retail chains around the world. So I think it goes back to what we were saying before, the importance of being able to report, validate, and then make improvements here to just gain access to these to the procurement.
Yeah, and I think again, these companies aren't doing this out of the goodness of their heart, right? They're doing it because there's a strategic reason. They're doing it because they know that climate conditions are changing, and they are worried about the costs that they're going to pay for those commodities in order to build their products, and they need to have consistent cost bases to make their margins on what they're selling to customers, right? So it behooves them to go in and try to figure out how to reduce all the inputs. You look at sustainable farming practices. We've seen instances where they've decreased input costs and therefore the amount of inputs that you need by 20 to 100% in some areas. So if you're a farmer and you can get the same yields without any input costs, that means that it's going to be a lot safer for that larger company to know that they're probably going to have pretty consistent pricing from you, right? Because they don't have that same variability in their input costs. And they also know that you're going to be more secure in terms of as a source of those commodities, because your financial well-being is also not tied to those markets either, right? So there's a huge amount of de-risking that happens alongside this climate action. I think really doesn't get talked about enough, that allows businesses to make sure that they've got the feedstock that they need in order to run their business profitably. And so, again, this is not about charity. This is about them trying to maintain a consistent, reliable source of feedstock for their products that they're selling.
And it's not just large companies either. I know in Ghana, I've been involved in a project there along with the United Nations. In Ghana, 20 years ago, pretty self-sufficient in tomatoes. That was totally displaced by imports from China. 2 years ago, there was no tomato industry in Ghana, but a lot of issues around security of supply, and so now you have community projects in Ghana that haven't totally displaced the Chinese imports, but now we've got a thriving domestic industry there that is using, as you say, the latest technology. This is, you don't put in a new manufacturing facility using out-of-date technology. All of the manufacturing facilities that we're seeing in markets, in developing nations, they're all the best technology, and that's what we're competing against here. Yep. They're all using technologies that are delivering low emissions here. So, those are some of the opportunities I think that we're seeing.
100%. Just to layer on top of that, Jay, and also they might have lower costs of capital to make those large investments because they're taking advantage of some of these programs too. So now you're competing against somebody who's not only more efficient, but also is able to make those investments at a lower cost of capital than you are.
Right.
Amazing. I'm going to cut us off because we're at time. I know that we could talk about this forever, but I think what I am excited about is the optimism around Canada's presence in the global market as everybody looks to diversify, as everybody looks to make sense of the next 5 to 10 years. Sustainability, as you've said, has to be a business benefit, and we're kind of beginning to understand that it is. It no longer is a kind of nice to have or cool to have. It's really becoming integral to building companies that will stand the test of time. So thank you both so much for sharing your thoughts and your opinions today. It's really valuable to hear from people who talk to businesses every day, and hopefully it can inspire some more businesses to take action and participate in a meaningful way. So thank you so much. We'll send out the recording and some notes afterwards, and some ways to get in touch with everyone that you've talked to or listened to here. And have a great rest of your day, everyone.
Thanks, Lauren.